There is a moment near the end of this story that you would not have believed unless you had stood in the grass and watched it happen yourself. It was a Tuesday in late October, the sky gone, the color of old pewter, the season's last warmth already folding itself away into the ground, and the road into the Harlan farm was so choked with wagons and motor trucks that the county deputy had to stand at the gate just to keep order. Inside the fence, 43 sows moved through the last of the year's pasture grass, with the kind of unhurried authority that belongs to creatures who have never been told they were nearly gone from the earth. And at the center of it all, boots muddy to the ankle, hair pressed flat under the brim of a canvas hat, stood Nora Harlan, 26 years old, $131 in a coat pocket that had held nothing but lint for most of the past 3 years, and she was turning people away. Not for cruelty, for arithmetic. There were simply not enough of the animals to go around, and Nora Harlan had worked too hard and waited too long and believed too much in the wrong moment to let any of that be undone now by selling in haste. 2.5 years earlier, no one would have given you good odds on that outcome. 2 years and 7 months before that October, to be exact, a different kind of Tuesday found Nora standing in mud nearly as deep, at the edge of a property that had not been called a farm by anyone with a straight face since her Uncle Clayton had let it go to thistle and rust in the last years of his life. He had died in March, owing 4 months of county tax and a debt to the feed store that Nora, as his only living kin, was not legally obligated to cover, but felt, in some stubborn corner of herself, was a thing that ought to be settled. What she had inherited was 80 acres of low ground east of Caldwell, a house with a leaking chimney, a barn roof that had surrendered to gravity on the south side, and 6 large, slow-moving hogs standing in a flooded backlot, looking at her with small, calm eyes. She had heard that the county assessor was already drawing up paperwork to sell the land for tax debt if she could not resolve the account by the 1st of September. That gave her 6 months. She had $62 and the clothes she had ridden in on. The hogs were the first thing people laughed about, not because hogs in general were funny, but because these particular hogs were, in the opinion of every practical person in Orange County, the single least useful variety of hog it was possible to own. They were Ossabaw Island hogs, a name most folks in that part of the state could not quite place and did not care to learn. They were smaller than a Duroc and darker than a Chester White. They moved slowly. They rooted constantly. They had heavy shoulders and short legs and faces that gave them an expression of mild, dignified contempt for the world around them. A man named Gerald Puckett, who ran 160 Berkshires on the hill farm above the creek and considered himself the foremost authority on swine in the lower county, said it plainly at the feed store on the Friday of Nora's first week. He said it loud enough that she could hear him from 2 aisles over, which she suspected was the point. Those Ossabaw hogs eat twice what they're worth and grow half what they should. Clayton Harlan kept them out of sentiment, same way a man keeps a broken clock, because his mother gave it to him. They're a decoration, a burden. He paused for effect. And they're being inherited by a young woman alone, which means the county ought to start making plans for that land right now. Because sentimental and alone doesn't run a farm, it just postpones a foreclosure. Nora set her flour and her salt on the counter and paid for them and walked out without a word. Being right, she had learned early in her life, was its own kind of reply. It simply took longer to deliver. The person who did not laugh was an old man named Bohuslav Prokaska, who everyone in the valley called Old Bo, a Bohemian immigrant who had run a small mixed farm on the creek's south bend for 31 years and who had, through some combination of patience and stubbornness and an almost mystical attentiveness to the behavior of land, made that farm productive in ways that baffled his neighbors. He came by on Nora's 3rd day with a jar of rendered lard and a cabbage from his root cellar and stood at the fence looking at the 6 sows with an expression Nora could not immediately read. "You know what these are," he said. It was not quite a question. "I know they're old-bred hogs," she said. "My uncle wrote me about them once. He said they were the kind that could find their own feed and survive a hard season." Old Bo nodded slowly. They're the kind that the land can keep without breaking itself, he said. A Berkshire or a Duroc, they want corn, and they want it poured into a trough. These ones, they will root the boggy ground and eat the mast and the tubers, and they will put fat on themselves from things that look like nothing. He tapped the fence post once with one finger. This land that people think is ruined. This wet ground, this clay, this is not useless ground. This is Ossabaw ground. You understand, the wrong animal in the right place is still wrong. But this animal in this particular place is not wrong. He looked at her. The question is whether you will last long enough to prove it. I mean to, Nora said. He nodded once more, as if that settled it, and went home. The weeks that followed were the kind that do not make good telling, but make good farmers. Nora cleared the south fence line and reset the posts. She mended the barn roof on the good side, the side where the sows could be gotten under cover, before a hard rain, using lumber she salvaged from the collapsed side itself. She was up before light every morning and working until the light failed every evening, and she ate simply and spent almost nothing because she had almost nothing to spend. She counted her money every Sunday night, the way a person counts heartbeats when they're frightened, not because counting helped, but because knowing the number was better than not knowing it. By the end of April, she had spent $21 on hardware and mended fencing and one pair of work gloves that replaced a pair worn straight through, and she had $41 left and approximately 5 months until September. The 6 sows, meanwhile, were doing what Old Beau had said they would do. The back lot, 40 acres of wet clay and scrub and river bottom trees that everyone had written off as worthless swamp, turned out to be for Ossabaw hogs very close to paradise. They rooted through the boggy soil with focused industry, churning up the fibrous roots and the mast and the insects that lived in the dark wet layers no one else paid attention to. They did not merely survive on that ground. They put on flesh. Not the fast, pale, waterlogged flesh of a commodity hog pushed through growth on poured corn, but slow, dark, dense muscle laced through with fat that ran in thin, white rivers. Nora noticed it by mid-May, the way their shoulders were filling, and she kept the observation to herself as carefully as a person banks a coal under ash. She had learned, by June, that there were almost no Ossabaw hogs left in the state. She had written 3 letters to breed registries and livestock boards, and the replies that came back were frank. The breed had been allowed to decline. Commercial farming had pushed toward faster finishing, leaner hogs for the packing houses. The Ossabaw was slow to finish and built fat. That made it, in the language of the modern buyer, inefficient. No one had kept records on breeding stock in the region for 11 years. What her uncle had preserved, apparently out of the same stubborn sentiment that had kept him on unworkable land into his old age, was very nearly the last of the line in the whole of the county, possibly in 3 counties. Nora read those letters alone at the kitchen table, in the light of a lamp that needed a new wick, and she sat very still for a long while. Then she took out her Sunday night ledger, and she did the arithmetic. 6 sows. If she could get them bred, she had been watching Old Beau's boar through the fence from the adjoining pasture. He was a mixed-breed animal but sturdy. She might expect first litters by late fall. A litter of 6 to 10 piglets per sow was reasonable. Call it 7 on the lean side. 42 piglets. She would keep the best gilts for breeding and sell the rest at weaning, or carry a few through to weight. Even at modest prices. For feeder pigs, the math began to breathe. The question, always the question, was whether she would last long enough to get there. September was still the wall. It was Old Beau who solved the September problem in the plain, practical way that he solved most problems. He came over in early July with his eldest son and 2 days of labor, and they helped Nora dig out and shore up a root cellar that had been half-caved for years, expanding it to hold vegetables through the winter. In exchange, Nora turned over a portion of the back lot for a month to let Old Beau's 2 young steers graze the grass at the edges, which she did not need, and which he did. This exchange was not spoken of as charity, by either party, which was the only reason it worked. Old Beau also, without ceremony, bought 6 smoked hams at a very fair price from Nora's existing stores from a steer she had butchered in early spring before she'd known she was staying. And the money from those hams was exactly enough, combined with what she had left, to cover the county's tax account with $9 to spare. Gerald Puckett heard about the tax payment and said nothing for 3 days. Then he said loudly at the grain cooperative that paying a tax bill was not the same as running a farm and that any person could hold on for one season out of pure stubbornness, but what comes next is what tells the story. He was not entirely wrong. Nora knew that. She lay awake on the nights when the rain came sideways off the creek and the barn roof flexed and groaned, and she counted what she had and what she needed, and the distance between those two numbers, and she did not let herself despair, because despair spent time and she had no time to spend. She adjusted, instead, the way a person adjusts a lamp wick, small, careful turns, not wholesale changes. By August, the sows had been bred, 3 of them successfully on the first attempt, using Old Beau's boar, and 3 requiring a second. Old Beau had located a registered Ossabaw boar 2 counties north, the animal belonging to an elderly widow who had not known what she had, and was glad to arrange a breeding fee that Nora paid in salt pork and labor, which was all the currency she had in practical quantity. August arrived like the open door of a furnace and held that temperature for 6 full weeks, and the boggy back lot, which people had always described as the farm's worst liability, turned out in that heat to be the only reliable water in the lower valley. The wet clay held its moisture when the upper fields cracked and went pale. The scrub willows along the creek bend kept the air 10 degrees cooler than the open pasture. The 6 sows lay in the shade of those willows at the worst of the day and rose in the cool mornings to root, and they did not suffer from the heat, the way a penned commercial hog would have suffered, because they were not penned. The drought that August ruined Gerald Puckett's corn on the upper fields. It ruined the corn of everyone who had put their faith in the dry slope ground that summer. The creek dropped to its bones, and the stock ponds went gray and cracked at the edges, and there were 3 families in the valley who were feeding cattle hay in August, which was a thing no one had expected to do before October. Nora watched the creek bend hold its water. She watched the willows stay green. She did not say anything to anyone about it, because there was nothing to say. The land was doing what it was going to do, and the only wisdom was to watch it closely and understand what it was telling you. That was the summer. A girl named Cecily Marsh started appearing at the fence. She was 11 years old, the youngest of the Marsh family from the farm half a mile north, and she had that particular quality found in certain children of seeming to materialize out of still air without warning. She appeared one morning in July at the gate with a question she had clearly been rehearsing. She asked Nora what the hogs' names were. Nora said she hadn't named them. Cecily regarded this as a serious moral failure and spent the next hour proposing names with methodical thoroughness. By noon, all 6 sows had been named: Henrietta, Mabel, Bess, Clara, Ruth, and Dolores, and Cecily Marsh had appointed herself their unofficial historian. She came most mornings before her own chores pulled her home, and she watched the sows with the focused attention of a scientist taking field notes. She was the one who noticed, in late September, that Henrietta was moving differently, slower even than usual, with a careful deliberateness that was different from her ordinary philosophical amble. And she told Nora about it with grave precision. Nora moved Henrietta to the dry corner of the barn that night. The first litter came 2 days later, 7 piglets, all living. They were small and dark and moved with a surprising quickness, and Cecily, who had been permitted to observe from a respectful distance, declared them each to be of sound character and assigned them names before the morning was out. Nora let her. It was easier than arguing, and the girl had an eye. Mabel followed, 6 days after Henrietta, Clara after that. By the 1st of November, all 6 sows had delivered, and Nora counted 44 piglets total, one better than her lean estimate, with 41 surviving past the first week. She sat in the barn on a cold Sunday night in November, with a lantern and her ledger, and she wrote the number down and looked at it for a long time. 41. She ran the arithmetic again, slowly, because she had learned not to trust hope that moved too fast. Keep the 10 best gilts for breeding stock, she wrote. That leaves 31 feeders and barrows. At spring weaning weight, at reasonable prices, that column of numbers added up to something that looked for the first time like a farm. It was around this time that a man named Arthur Lund came through the county. He was a buyer out of the city, a provisioner really, who supplied restaurants and fine hotels in the capital with the kinds of things that ordinary wholesale markets did not handle: aged cheeses, heritage breed, poultry, specialty smoked meats. He had been sent by a chef who had heard, through the kind of circuitous gossip that moves through restaurant kitchens, that someone in Oran County was running old breed hogs on river bottom land. Lund arrived on a Wednesday morning in December without having written ahead, which he later explained was his habit when investigating tips that seemed improbable. He wanted to see the animals before he announced himself, so that the animals would be as they were, and not as they were prepared to be seen. He stood at the fence for 20 minutes before Nora came out of the barn and saw him there. She walked over without hurrying. He introduced himself plainly, and she received him the same way, and after a moment she opened the gate and let him stand among the sows, which regarded him with their characteristic expression of dignified indifference. Lund crouched down and put his hand along the flank of Mabel, who accepted this with great patience. He looked at the jowl and the shoulder and the depth of the belly. He asked Nora how the animals were fed, and she told him about the back lot, the root and mast feeding, the boggy ground. He asked about the lineage, and she told him what she knew, and she showed him the letters from the breed registries. He read them carefully, standing in the barn in his city coat with his hat held in both hands. "Do you know," he said, "what the fat profile of an Ossabaw hog is, compared to a commercial breed?" "I know the meat is darker and the fat is denser," Nora said. "The fat is higher in oleic acid," Lund said, "the same fat found in good olive oil. The Spanish pata negra pig, the finest cured ham in the world, is a close relative, raised en masse. What you have here," he gestured at the barn at the sows, at the back lot beyond, "is something that barely exists anymore in this part of the country, raised in exactly the conditions that make it worth something extraordinary." He paused. "I would like to talk to you about a supply arrangement. When will you have animals at weight?" "Spring. For the first run," Nora said. "I've kept back the 10 best gilts for breeding. I'll have those 31 to weight by May or June." "I want them," Lund said. "All 31, at a price I'll write down for you now, and you will tell me if it is fair." He wrote the price and handed her the paper. Nora looked at it. It was, she calculated quickly, 3.5 times what Puckett got for his Berkshires by the pound at the packing house. Cooperative. She read it twice to be sure she had the decimal in the right place. She had. "That is fair," she said, with a steadiness she was mildly proud of. "I thought it might be," Lund said, and they shook hands. She told no one. Old Beau came for coffee 2 days after Lund's visit, and sat at the kitchen table with his hands around the cup and listened to her account of the conversation. And at the end of it, he said simply, "Good." Then he said, "When you were a child, did someone tell you to trust the low ground that others pass over?" "Not in those words," Nora said. "My father said it to me in Bohemian," Old Beau said. "It means, do not be in a hurry to call a thing worthless. The worth is there. It is only waiting for someone patient enough to find it." He drank his coffee. "You found it." The winter was hard in the way that winters in that valley tended to be hard, which was not dramatically, but steadily, a long gray wearing down. Nora kept the sows in good condition through January and February on a combination of stored root vegetables, the last of the mast she had piled under shelter in November, and a small amount of supplemental grain that Lund's advance payment, a portion against the spring delivery, made possible without distress to her accounts. She banked the rest of the advance in a bank in the county seat, walking in with her canvas coat and her muddy boots, and transacting this business with a woman behind the counter who did not comment on the boots, which Nora appreciated. The 10 gilts she had kept for breeding were growing into their mother's shape. Short-legged, heavy-shouldered, with those same small, calm eyes. Cecily Marsh had named every one of them, naturally, and kept a written record in a schoolbook that she brought to the farm as if it were a field journal, which, in a practical sense, it was. The girl had an extraordinary capacity for observation. She noted the order in which the gilts ate, the way certain ones sought shade and others tolerated sun, which ones tended toward the willows, and which preferred the higher, drier edge of the lot. This was, though Cecily did not yet know the word for it, behavioral phenotyping, and Nora found it genuinely useful because breeding good animals was not only about lineage but about disposition, and you could not know disposition without watching. Gerald Puckett noticed the activity on the Harlan farm in February, when the corn market was still struggling from the previous summer's drought losses, and he was carrying debt into the new year that he had not expected to carry. He rode down the lane one afternoon, not to the gate, but sitting on his horse at the road, watching the farm, with the particular expression of a man revising an opinion he had stated very publicly. He did not come in. He rode on after a while. The 31 pigs reached finishing weight in May. Lund came with 2 assistants and a hired wagon, and the transaction was conducted efficiently and honestly. And when it was finished, Nora stood in the yard counting the payment, while old Beau stood nearby and did not count it for her because she didn't need him to. The sum was, after expenses, enough to pay off the last of her uncle's feed store debt, fund another breeding cycle, begin proper repair of the barn's collapsed south wing, and deposit the remainder in the county bank. She had, by her accounting, crossed from survival into stability. The distance between those two things felt, in that moment, like miles. The second year moved faster. The 10 gilts were bred in early summer to the registered boar from the North County, the widow having passed away in the spring, but the boar having been acquired by a cousin who was glad of the continuing arrangement. Lund sent the chef who had started the whole chain of inquiry, a man named Fentress, 40 years old, thinning on top, wearing an apron under his traveling coat as if he had been interrupted mid-service, to see the farm for himself. Fentress stood in the back lot for a long time without speaking. He crouched in the mud and looked at the willows and the wet clay and the rooting hogs. He said, finally, "This is the same kind of ground. This is the same kind of work." Nora was not sure what he meant exactly, but she nodded, and he placed an order for the following year that was nearly double what Lund had contracted. By the 3rd season, the one that would end in that October of the muddy boots and the backed-up wagons at the gate, Nora had 43 sows. She had the barn repaired. She had the house chimney sound. She had 3 registered Ossabaw boars of her own, one of them a son of the North County animal, and she had begun keeping her own breeding records in ledgers that were, by now, thick enough to be consulted by the State Agricultural Extension Office, which had heard about the herd through Lund and had sent a man in August to look at them. The extension man's name was Delaney, and he was professional and thorough, and he asked good questions. And when he left, he told Nora that she was, to his current knowledge, maintaining the largest registered Ossabaw breeding herd in the state by a margin that he would describe as significant. By what margin, roughly? Nora asked. Delaney checked his notes. The next closest holding is 4 animals, he said. You have 43. She thanked him for coming and walked him to his motor truck and watched him go. Then she went back to the barn, where Cecily, now 13, was updating the breeding register with the focused seriousness of a person who understands that the record is the thing. Old Beau was sitting on an upturned bucket in the doorway, with a piece of bread and a square of hard cheese, having arrived, as he tended to arrive, without particular announcement. Delaney says we have the largest herd in the state, Nora said. Old Beau chewed his bread. Of course, he said. That was when Gerald Puckett began to become a different kind of problem. He had watched the Harlan farm's recovery from a distance for 2 full years, and what had started as dismissal had curdled, by slow degrees, into a kind of envy that eventually overcame his pride. He had rebuilt some of his losses from the drought year by switching more acreage to oats. But the corn market remained uncertain, and his Berkshires, though fine animals, were selling at the cooperative standard prices into a market that Nora was now operating entirely outside of. In September of the third year, Puckett came to the farm in his good coat and his good hat and sat at Nora's kitchen table and made an offer to buy the farm. The offer was for the land at its original tax-assessed value, the low value, the value from 3 years ago when it was in arrears and half-ruined, plus what he called a reasonable premium for the existing livestock, by which he meant a price per head that was Nora calculated, in the space of 10 seconds. Roughly 40% of what Lund was currently paying for finished animals. She offered him coffee, which he accepted. She listened to the offer in its entirety without interrupting. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "Gerald," she said, "how did you know the count? You said 43 sows. I haven't posted a count anywhere." Puckett adjusted his hat. "People talk," he said. "They do," Nora said. "And Delaney's report goes to the extension board, which is public record. I imagine you read it." She folded her hands on the table. "The land isn't for sale. The animals aren't for sale at that price, and they wouldn't be for sale to a buyer who wanted them in a commercial context in any case, because the breeding value depends on keeping the herd intact and on the practices, not just on the animals themselves." She looked at him calmly. "You'd undo in a season what took 3 years to build." Puckett said that he was trying to help her, that running a place like this alone was more than any single woman could sustain indefinitely, that she ought to think about security, that she was still young and the winters were long. Nora said, "I'm aware of the winters. I've worked through 2 of them." She stood, which ended the conversation without requiring her to say anything unkind. She walked him to the door on the porch. He paused. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I've made mistakes," she said. "This isn't one." What Puckett did next, and what ultimately undid him in the eyes of the community, was a smaller and pettier thing than an outright scheme. SACTA. He went to the cooperative board on which he sat as a senior member, and proposed that the quarterly livestock demonstration traditionally held at rotating farms should not be held at the Harlan farm that fall, on the grounds that the operation was, as he put it, too specialized and too small-scale to be instructive to general farmers. The board voted on it, and the motion passed, 4-3. Nora was informed by letter. She received the letter on a Wednesday morning and read it at the kitchen table and set it down. Old Beau, who had developed an almost supernatural sense of when he was needed, arrived that afternoon with a jar of his wife's pickled beets and sat at the table and read the letter and set it down in the same way. "He is afraid," Old Beau said. "I know," Nora said. "A man who is afraid will use whatever small authority he has. I know that too." "What will you do?" Nora thought about it. "I'll open the farm myself," she said. "Not for the cooperative. Just open. Anyone who wants to come and look is welcome to come and look. No charge. No obligation." She paused. "And I'll write to Lund and ask if he can bring Fentress." Old Beau considered this. "A man comes from the city with opinions about meat," he said slowly, "and the farmers of this valley listen because they are curious about money." He almost smiled. "Yes, write to Lund." She wrote the letter that evening. Lund replied within the week. Fentress would come. Lund would come. Lund would bring additionally a woman named Sorensen, who was a buyer for the hotel trade in 2 other cities, and who had been trying for a year to find a secondary source for heritage breed pork of this quality. Nora wrote an announcement by hand, had it printed at the county paper's office. A courtesy, not a paid advertisement, because the editor, a woman named Crabbe, who had watched the Harlan farm's progress with quiet interest, offered the space without prompting, and it ran the week before the open day. It said simply that the Harlan farm would be open for any neighbor or interested party to come and observe the Ossabaw herd, that Nora Harlan would answer questions about the breed, and that guests from the city would be present to speak to the market for heritage livestock. The road on that Tuesday morning in late October was, as has been said, impossible. Nora had not anticipated that specific degree of response, but she held to her plan. She answered every question. Honestly, she walked people through the back lot and the barn. She let them handle the breeding ledgers and look at the records. Fentress cooked a small demonstration over an open fire in the yard, using cuts from one of the finished barrows she had processed the week before, and the smell alone brought 3 additional families down the road who had not been invited. Old Beau sat on his bucket in the barn doorway and received visitors with a calm authority that was, Nora thought, exactly appropriate. Cecily Marsh ran a very organized system of directing foot traffic so that the sows would not be disturbed in their characteristic meditative roaming, and she did this with a firmness that surprised even the adults. Lund and Sorensen and Fentress sat with Nora after the last visitors had gone, at the kitchen table where Puckett had sat 6 weeks before, with his good coat and his low offer. They talked numbers with the directness that Nora had come to value in Lund, which was the directness of a man who understood that her time was worth the same as his. Sorensen wanted a minimum of 60 finished animals per year, in addition to Lund's existing contract. Nora told her she could not commit to 60 for the following year, because responsible breeding expansion was not a thing she was willing to rush. She could commit to 30. In the year after that, subject to the breeding outcomes and the herd's own rate of increase, she believed she could reach 60. She would not sign a contract she could not fulfill. Sorensen looked at her for a moment. "Most suppliers promise what I ask and deliver what they can," she said. "I know," Nora said. "I'm telling you what I can actually deliver." They signed for 30, with a written option on the additional volume the following year, and the price Sorensen offered was, if anything, more favorable than Lund's, because Sorensen was buying into a reputation that she believed was worth paying ahead of the market for. After they left, Nora sat alone at the table for a while, with the signed papers in front of her. She had $131 in her coat pocket, cash from the day's pig sales to 3 neighboring farms who had bought weaning-age jilts at fair prices. She had 2 contracts. She had 43 sows. She had a functioning farm on ground that everyone had written off as worthless, and she had gotten there in 2 years and 7 months by watching the quiet economy that everyone else had decided to ignore. She heard the gate. Old Beau came across the yard in the last of the October light, moving with the careful gait of a man who has put his body to hard use for 30 years and made his peace with that. He came in without knocking, because after 2 years he no longer needed to, and he sat down at the table and looked at the signed papers and did not read them, because it was not his business to read them, but he understood what they were. "Well," he said. "Well," Nora said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father's saying, the one about the low ground." "I remember," Nora said. "Do not be in a hurry to call a thing worthless," Old Beau said. "The worth is there. It is only waiting for someone patient enough to find it." He looked at the papers. "You found it." Outside, in the last of the October light, the 43 sows moved through the pasture grass with the unhurried authority of creatures who had never been told they were nearly gone from the earth. The willows along the creek bend held their last leaves. The boggy ground that had been called ruined and useless was dark and rich and full of the slow work of roots. Gerald Puckett would sell his upper fields before the following spring and reduce his herd by half, and it would not be Nora's doing. It would be the market's, which does not care about coats and hats and motions passed by cooperative boards. It cares about what the thing is actually worth. And 3 families in the valley who could not afford weaning-age stock that fall would receive, in December, an unmarked envelope with a note in plain handwriting offering a spring delivery of 2 gilts, each, at half price, no obligation, terms to be discussed when ready. Those 6 animals would seed 3 new small herds, and those herds would, in time, be connected by bloodline and by practice to the Harland farm, until the breed that had almost disappeared from the county was woven back into the valley in a way that no single crisis and no single greedy man and no single hard winter could easily undo. It had worked, not because anyone had helped her, though some had, not because the market had been kind, though it had eventually been fair. It had worked because Nora Harlan had looked at 6 old hogs standing in flooded ground on a ruined farm and had seen, in the way that patient people see things that impatient people cannot, not what was there. She had bent down to the low ground. She had trusted it. And the low ground, as it always does for those who will stay and listen to it, had given everything it had.